We call it the public school to prison pipeline because the schools become like prisons. And the more children have contact with officers when they're younger, the more likely they are to end up in jail and prison instead of in college.
What is the school to prison pipeline? We're going to talk to attorney Shannon Kennedy about that on today's Ask the Lawyer. Shannon, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
Great to talk to you. Can you explain to us what you've seen in your practice where minor children are arrested for misdemeanors on public school property? And give us some examples, because I know your website says burping, refusing to hand over cell phones, or failure to attend detention, which is pretty amazing.
Yes, sadly, in the state of New Mexico, as across this country, we see in public schools after the Columbine shootings that police officers who were retired would sign back up to the force and become school resource officers and be placed within schools. And they began to criminalize basically the class clown. So we saw, sadly, disproportionately children of color and particularly young African-American female students being arrested for not following the rules. Like, for instance, we had a client who was arrested because she wouldn't put her cell phone away. Now, if she wasn't in school, of course, she couldn't be arrested for not putting her cell phone away. So we were seeing school districts that were getting rid of certain children by calling the school resource officer, arresting these children, removing them to detention centers, without even telling their parents that they'd been removed from school. So we did some class action lawsuits to prevent the criminalization of basically misbehavior by middle school and high school students. We even had a 7-year-old autistic child who was handcuffed to a chair because that child was not was unruly. And oftentimes we see children who are disabled being disproportionately arrested by school resource officers in violation of their IEPs, their individualized educational plans. So we call it the public school to prison pipeline because the schools become like prisons. And the more children have contact with officers when they're younger, the more likely they are to end up in jail and prison instead of in college.
Wow, it's really amazing to hear this conversation going on in 2022. But I want to ask you, are these minor infractions usually handled through the school administration, or is it common for the police to be involved with this?
Well, what happened is we used to have principals and assistant principals who would discipline those students, like Breakfast Club, where everyone gets detention for being late or for goofing off in class or passing notes, or the one who was burping and made a joke. And the other thing we see is that many of these arrests are taking place before the lunch hour. And when you have public schools that provide a free lunch or provide breakfast for students, there is far more disruption in the classrooms and far fewer arrests. So there's just very simple solutions to stop this. But one thing that was happening was that the principals, instead of doing their traditional functioning of disciplining rowdy students, would instead just call the school resource officer, have them arrested and removed from school, and then they were suspended because they'd been arrested, thereby leapfrogging the due process rights of the students. So it was a way to get rid of students without due process by using school resource officers to remove those students that, were having disciplinary problems.
And you've already touched on this a little bit, but tell us a little bit more about the school to prison pipeline. And is this a problem throughout the state of New Mexico?
It was a problem, most specifically in the city of Albuquerque. Usually the public school to prison pipeline is something that happens in inner cities. It's an urban problem. I mean, just like everyone knows, in rural areas where everyone grows up together and there's a sense of community, there are not school resource officers that have been put in the public schools. So this is really a problem that disproportionately impacts urban kids growing up in the city, in the public schools. And sadly, instead of investing in social workers and therapists and after-school programs and the arts and all of the things that enrich inner school communities, instead, school districts were paying for the police to come in and, search the lockers of children and really turning schools into detention centers instead of places of joy and public learning.
And you said it's mostly affecting disabled people and minorities there. So
absolutely. It has a disparate impact and is discriminatory. And the statistics bear that out all out the country.
So what do you hope to accomplish with this type of legislation, this types of litigation? And how can this school to prison pipeline be stopped, or can it be stopped?
Well, in the city of Albuquerque, we reduced the number of students being removed from school by simply making rules that the school resource officers could not arrest and remove children for nonviolent misdemeanor crimes or, misconduct. So if there is in fact a student who is threatening either physically or with a weapon on campus, of course that is a felony crime and that child could be removed. However, if it's a nonviolent misdemeanor, officers were instructed to de-escalate the situation, call the parents, and if the child still needed to be removed, to be taken to a community center as opposed to the D-home. And of course, there was no need for the restraint or the handcuffing of children.
Right. Well, we really appreciate your expertise, Shannon. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
We appreciate your time. That'll do it for this episode of Ask the Lawyer. My guest has been Shannon Kennedy. If you want to ask Shannon a question about your situation, call the number you see on your screen. Thanks for watching. I'm Tom Mustin for Ask the Lawyers.